Okay, I'm going to touch upon a slightly touchy subject here, as I do sometimes on the channel. I usually stay in ancient times and ancient histories, and as far back as we can go, I'm more happy, it seems, than to come closer towards our current time. There's probably a lot of reason for that, because a lot of it starts to get personal for not just me, but just everybody in general, whether referring to archaic times 2, 3, 5, 8, 10,000 years ago. But was directed this, and I was going to do one last year on this concept and did not whenever I did my other two on Irish history and the one of JFK and the Irish Brigade and his presentation of the flag and so on. But here it hits me again, and I'm like, the whole thing just stinks. But there's a lot of SJW type of looks and really being PC and twisted histories and oh, no, no, no going on. And I'd like to show you just a bit of it that goes on, and what is an exaggeration and what is not. This is about the forced breeding myth and the Irish slaves. Meme, he calls it, of course, which is, there became a popular meme, and a lot of stuff come out of that. But a meme comes from some type of reality of somebody finding out information, and then somebody's going to try to minimize it. This was done by Liam Hogan. Looks like a young white guy here holding his cat. And so he researched about slavery a little bit, and it's funny, I have too. Let's look into this. He says there's so much bad history surrounding the Irish were slaves too meme that one could write 100,000 word corrective and still have much left to debunk. Here I target one of the most racist aspects of the meme, which claims that female Irish servants were forced to breed with enslaved African men in the British American colonies. Now, what's strange about that, and it's kind of hidden and not really like bam put out there, of course, when people started looking into this, and they're kind of directed not to, but there's a common genetic Caucasian admix in Negroids, and anytime it's shown up until fairly lately, everybody always says, oh, that's that white slave master, and so on along that line. And the reality of this is that when looking at it and people getting their My DNA test and all that going on just expounds upon it by millions of times, you find this common, very common, seemingly similar admix that's in them. And this strange similar admix that's in them doesn't really show Jewish diaspora, as you would think from the Jewish slave masters of the Jewish slave trade is what it's been referred to as. And of course the whole slavery ability was because of a chattel slavery that they had in the Bible that was supposed to last 7 years, and it's really kind of an indentured servitude, but you work your ass off, and in doing so you're given something at the end of it, and possibly even land from this major landowner. It's a way for a person to do something and get somewhere in life and get something going on for him back in the day. And that was taken out of constraint quite a bit. Now, there was a lot of slavery that went on that had nothing to do with that, of course. But then there are other types of slavery where it was like an indentured servitude concept where this happened. And that's just the way that all of America was from its origin, even with black people, until a black man, a previous freed black man who owned land, and he was a slave owner himself, had a slave named John Casor. He went to court and demanded that blacks get lifetime slavery, that he get lifetime slavery for John Casor, that in his selling it was never meant to be anything chattel and so on, that blacks weren't given that opportunity, and it wasn't on that way in any way, shape, or form. And he actually won, setting a standard which changed things somewhat. But at this time there had been supposedly, due to records, 6 times as many Irish slaves in the Americas, counting South America, where 92% of all the slaves, the black slaves from Africa, had gone to too. but a lot of those were castrated and things and archaic practices. I probably won't get into too much, but some of in this part here when we talk about it. So this is part 3 of my series, Debunking the Irish Slave Meme, he says. So apparently I was given part 3 instead of 1, and I guess I could go back and go through these all, and indeed I may, but let's just look into this. This predication of while helpless whites look on. And in a current nation, we see helpless whites look on as we invited our immigrants in, and they're trying to come in and tear up the United States and what it was founded for, and the ideals that it had just not long ago, and the reason we were a world-leading country. And they seem to want to try to deviate that situation and see how much change and twist can happen to a good, strong thing that should not be really manipulated. But that's another thing altogether. So here he goes into the myth. In the 17th century, Barbados and elsewhere, planters forcibly bred female Irish servants with male African slaves. This practice was so widespread that it had been banned, as it was impacting on the profits made by slave trading companies. Now, supposedly the ideal here, and there's a lot of documentation to this, is that the blacks weren't smart enough to do and all this type of stuff, that they weren't catching on. It was a problem for, this is not in the Americas really, this is all in South American cane fields and so on. And these Barbary type pirates here from, Barbados, and North African Barbary type pirates from long ago that had started this thing had decided to take Irish and some of their Caucasian slave women and just basically drop them off or leave them with the black males, and making a mulatto female or a mulatto offspring, and these mulatto offspring were used to breed back into themselves in trying to get a more intelligent and more compliant class of people out of them that could do more. And it became a problem, and the blacks that were capturing and selling their own kind in West Africa and selling them off became extremely mad about this, because they wanted to sell more of their own kind. In 1807, America outlawed any import whatsoever of raw black African slaves, and the end of the cane fields and the bust of that is what gave us a large portion of the 6 or 8% that we got total out of the African slave trade that happened altogether. But people don't want to look at that rationale in a reasonable way, in any way, shape, or form too. And so some examples of this, it says white women in particular were singled out for this punishment in the fields, sometimes to satisfy a perverted craving. The mulatto drivers would then force the women to strip naked before commencing the flogging. While the women were weeding in the fields in that condition, the drivers often satisfied their lust by taking them from the rear. Sean O'Callaghan, To Hell or Barbados, the Ethnic Cleansing of Ireland. And this goes back to showing the Irish slaves in America, something we've pretty much tried to get past. But if people are going to start talking about slavery in odd and wrong ways, then it all should be brought back up again and then allowed to go from there again. If anybody talks about reparations to what happened to a people, it shall start with the first slaves of America, and it would have been the Irish. Some of the physical larger blacks were made guards and were given certain privileges, namely Irish women. There had been several Irish killed trying to protect the Irish women from being assaulted by these savage blacks. Lawrence R. Keller, To Shed a Tear, A Story of Irish Slavery in the British West Indies, back in 2001, a well-documented book. The settlers began to breed Irish women and girls with African men to produce slaves with a distinct complexion. These new mulatto slaves brought a higher price than Irish livestock, who were persecuted badly at the time if you'll look deep into it, and likewise enabled the settlers to save money rather than purchase new African slaves and have to pay for import and the charges that were happening from the Jewish slave masters. This was actually seen as something bad that they didn't like. So this practice of interbreeding Irish females with African men went on for several decades and longer, and was so widespread that in 1861 a legislation was passed forbidding the practice of mating Irish slave women to African slave men for the purpose of producing slaves for sale. In short, it was stopped only because it was interfered with the profits of large slave transport company. John Martin, The Irish Slave Trade, The Forgotten White Slave, 2008. This African could serve as a stud for the inexpensive Irish women slaves. These breeding programs were stopped because it was reducing the profits of the Royal African Company. But due to the profitability of these breeding programs, the practice continued until well after the end of Ireland's potato famine. Guy Nixon, Slavery in the West, The Untold Story of Slavery of the Native Americans in the West, 2011. So these are all recently and well documented. Well, female Irish, but some are quite old too, and there's a lot of elders, and they're working off of these. These are where their quotes come from, is from direct people involved. Female Irish slaves were raped by their owners and bred to male African slaves to produce offspring who would grow into big, strong mulatto slaves. Maggie Plummer, author of Spirited Way, a novel of the stolen Irish. Lake Country writer examines Irish enslavement in the historical novel, The Miss Luyan, 2012. The black or mulatto overseers often forced the Irish women to strip while working in the fields and often used them sexually as well. Radio Too Hot, The Irish Slaves, What They Will Never Ever Tell You in History Class, 2013, Radio Too Hot. The most unfortunate of these young Irish girls were taken to stud farms to breed with the most favored of the black slaves. Jennifer Dixon, To Hell or Barbados. Was life for the Irish slave worse than that of the African slave? The Barnes Review, September and October of 2013. The Barnes Review is a journal dedicated to Holocaust denial. They want to throw in there. She would like to, or this person named Hogan would like to throw in there. There are even documents of parentages saved from the archives of the Montserrat Library during the June 1997 volcanic eruption that destroyed much of the island. These documents read like animal pedigree papers, showing the pairing of young Irish girls with Mandingo warriors to breed a better slave, more capable of working in the burning sun. Mike McCormack, Ancient Order of Hibernians, History Ireland magazine, September and October of 2017. This guy says, debunked. There's no evidence for any of these claims in the British West Indies and the British North American colonies, yet that's what he's reading out to you directly. These ahistorical claims are part racially sadomasochistic fantasy, he thinks in his mind, and part old white supremacist myths a la The Birth of a Nation that heighten racist sentiment in the Irish slaves meme. Oh, that's a weird cuckling statement too, for we the people was always Caucasians. The blacks weren't considered to be that. It wasn't, hey, that came so much later. That came, allowing them actually fighting, dying, people maiming themselves for life and things, but dying for freeing all people from any idea of indentured servitude or slavery. Read the Emancipation Proclamation. Also read Abraham Lincoln's own speeches and see what he says about the idea and the reason he actually set the blacks free to tune on to the South so he could try to unify the nation and didn't want it to be separated. Most people don't realize, but most of the nation was bought from Spain down in that area, and they already had this going on quite well, for it was the Spaniards and the Portuguese and so on that started the Irish slave trade down in South America. Anyhow, natural results. The screams of the ravished daughters of the sunny South have placed the Negro in the lowest rank of the beast kingdom. That's a strange thing, really wants to show the meme, but yeah, there was a lot of white women that got raped, and there was lynchings and things for it. Of course, everybody looks back at all those like, oh, they were all a good boy. They were on their way to church, and everybody just did things and stuff, and somebody did something somewhere. Furthermore, he says the racist who promotes this propaganda will be very interested to hear that microhistory, which the meme represents, is a famous case where a freeborn Irish woman loved and willingly married an enslaved African man. And I'm sure that that went on. In fact, I have found documentation of such. And we have found mass documentation like in the Jefferson case, where it actually seems to be a consensual situation. And there are other consensual situations. In fact, if you watch the black man, I forget his name off the top of my head, that does this genetic looking at black people, and he tells you where you came from, Ghana and Chad and stuff. No, you weren't Egyptians. No, you weren't the biblical people. Apparently, they're the ones that brought you over here, these Jewish slave masters. But I digress. What he shows in that is Tom Joyner, I believe, is the one that comes to mind, where he says, no, this man built a house next door for this lady, and it was a secret relationship they had. And then he shows a picture of him, and it has these funny grayish eyes. And he goes, nobody in my family has these eyes. And really, I look into the picture of these eyes, and that is where that comes from and stuff. And of course, I think in that one too, he said that he thought that he came from the Amerindians, that he had a lot of Indian in him, and he showed up to have almost negligible none. Along with another video that shows so many black people saying that they were part Amerindian, and they really don't have any trace, if small, minute amounts, if any at all. And a lot of Caucasians show double to 3 times that amount. But funny, we have lately the Princess Pocahontas, who actually claimed it, and then showed up to have some, but far too small to have claimed what she claimed. So, anyhow. In Barbados, the colony where the meme is mostly centered, the evidence of any forced breeding program of white female servants and black males, no, I believe that he was just reading them, and the accounts, and those aren't from like, oh, this happened one time in any way, shape, or form. And so maybe we can see where the genetics that seems real common came from certain stock of people, and then the blacks bred back in with themselves, leaving him the 20% or so admix of Caucasian that seems very similar to each other that they have today, that's all blamed on rampant different slave masters. For it always shows a good little percentage of North African. There's about 5 variations on a theme that you see in this, maybe 6 people have pointed out, where it shows a little North African, and it shows English and Irish, and it shows an Irish trace, and some of that North African seems to be caught in the Irish people beforehand, and then a mulatto situation is made and then bred back through that. Yeah, so it seems like that's where a lot of that comes from. For if they had that and then an interaction like Tom Joyner and so on, you see he's a lot lighter, carry a lot of other capabilities, and there was somebody that was a more double mulatto situation, or even a 50-50 to a mulatto back to and so on. In fact, you can go white with that, and you can go dark with that. Let's continue. So, anyhow, forced breeding. Conversely, voluntary unions between white female servants and black slaves, while rare, did occur in some colonies, and I agree it probably did. In fact, I think there's documentation of that I just spoke of. And it reversed the other way too. It wasn't females and males, but it went the other way. So you'll find that in this, he's going to talk about black men on white women, even though that's what it shows plainly happened to what caused their admix. It wasn't the other way around. In fact, there were some, and he talks about them there, but it seemed a little more rare than what had actually happened to bring their admix. Let's continue. If we review the British American colonies as a whole in the 17th and 18th centuries, we can reasonably conclude that the range of laws enacted to prevent intermarriages were a reaction to this fact rather than preemptive legislation. After researching this in some detail, I conclude that the false narrative refers to legislation passed in 1681 in colonial Maryland. The colonists in Maryland, as in other nascent British colonies, discouraged marriage and sexual relations between whites and blacks. Interracial marriages and stuff. People don't realize that before this, it was like the Greeks didn't like and people right next to them that were all Caucasians. And the variations between that subtle difference and something like this was seen as being, just quite like, but anyhow, let's continue. Of course, nowadays we're trying to look at things a whole lot differently, but this is the reality of the way the world was not too long ago, as we're reading. After researching this in some detail, he concludes that the false narrative refers to legislation passed in 1681, so that long ago, in colonial Maryland. The colonists in Maryland, as in other nascent colonies, discouraged that practice. But in 1664, they codified in law what slavery was race-based, perpetually and hereditary. This positively law also sought to restrict and enforce the color line by severely punishing free white women who married or had sexual relations with enslaved black men. And this is after the interaction of the laws of the previously freed black man, Anthony Johnson, who had gone to court and made a clarification that these people may be under indentured servitude. Now, it's believed that, and well documented, that the Irish slaves were treated much worse than the black people that cost a whole lot more money. And certain people that were very rich bought a lot of very strong and healthy mulatto black men, and then women, and then due to choice of what they had to breed with, ended up breeding together, making even stronger ones. And as Jimmy the Greek said, and got kicked off NBC or whatever it was for a long time ago, this brings about a much stronger and larger black man we see in football and sports today and stuff, for they didn't really have that going on as much back then, and lack of nutritions and things like that. But anyhow, so an act concerning Negroes and other slaves in 1664. So I guess he's going to read the whole thing, and I will. Be it enacted by the right honorable the Lord Propriety, by the advice and consent of the upper and lower house of this present General Assembly, that all Negroes or other slaves already within the province, and all Negroes and other slaves to be hereafter imported into the province, shall serve durante vita, or hard labor for life. That's not really what that means. It doesn't mean hard labor for life. Vita means life, and durante means long term, or actually to prosper in some lights. I don't know, you can look up Durante, like Jimmy Durante, and it actually doesn't have to do with hard labor. That's not what his name was referring to either. And all children born of any Negro or other slave shall be slaves as their father